Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. This is a podcast where I read old books, sometimes fiction, sometimes non-fiction, in the most boring way I can, to try to help slow your spinning mind, enough for you to fall asleep in the most natural way possible. The stresses of life often follow us to bed and keep us company, but I'm here to distract you from them and help you drift away. But before you do fall asleep, if you find Sleepy Time Tales helpful and you would like to support me to keep it going out to you and thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that gets you fun bonuses based on your contribution level, including early releases, bonus episodes, and different edits of the main episode. So go take a look and sign up if you're interested. If monthly's a bit much, you can also put the tips in the tip jar in the Ko-Fi that's linked in the show notes. The Patreon is linked there as well. And as I've mentioned in a couple of the previous episodes, I am going through a bit of a financial squeeze at the moment. Not a really super desperate situation, so don't stress too much. But if you have been inclined to support the show and just kind of never gotten around to it, now really would be a good time, whether it's on the Patreon or just a little something in the tip jar. That's enough of me rattling a can at you. Let's get back to something which I haven't done since last year actually, and one of the people who contributed reminded me about this. So let's learn a little more about women's suffrage and a potential love triangle. We return again to Night and Day by Virginia Woolf. She sat herself down to her letters, and very soon all these speculations were forgotten. And the two lines drew themselves between her eyebrows, as the contents of the letters, the office furniture, and the sounds of activity in the next room gradually asserted their sway upon her. By 11 o'clock the atmosphere of concentration was running so strongly in one direction that any thought of a different order could hardly have survived its birth more than a moment or so. The task which lay before her was to organize a series of entertainments, the profits of which were to benefit the society, which drooped for want of funds. It was her first attempt at organization on a large scale, and she meant to achieve something remarkable. She meant to use the cumbrous machine to pick out this, that, and the other interesting person from the muddle of the world, and to set them for a week in a pattern which must catch the eyes of cabinet ministers. And the eyes, once caught, the old arguments were to be delivered with unexampled originality. Such was the scheme as a whole, and in contemplation of it she would become quite flushed and excited, and have to remind herself of all the details that intervened between her and success. The door would open, and Mr. Clacton would come in to search for a certain leaflet buried beneath a pyramid of leaflets. He was a thin, sandy-haired man of about 35, spoke with a Cockney accent, and had about him a frugal look, as if nature had not dealt generously with him in any way, which naturally prevented him from dealing generously with other people. When he had found his leaflet, and offered a few jocular hints upon keeping papers in order, the typewriting would stop abruptly, and Mrs. Seal would burst into the room with a letter which needed explanation in her hand. This was a more serious interruption than the other, because she never knew exactly what she wanted, and half a dozen requests would bolt from her, no one of which was clearly stated. Dressed in plum-coloured velveteen, with short grey hair, and a face that seemed permanently flushed with philanthropic enthusiasm, she was always in a hurry, and always in some disorder. She wore 2 crucifixes, which got themselves entangled in a heavy gold chain upon her breast, and seemed to Mary expressive of her mental ambiguity. Only her vast enthusiasm, and her worship of Miss Markham, one of the pioneers of the society, kept her in her place, for which she had no sound qualification. So the morning wore on, and the pile of letters grew, and Mary felt, at last, that she was the centre ganglion of a very fine network of nerves which fell over England, and one of these days, when she touched the heart of the system, would begin feeling and rushing together, and emitting their splendid blaze of revolutionary fireworks. For some such metaphor represents what she felt about her work, when her brain had been heated by 3 hours of application. Shortly before 1 o'clock, Mr. Clacton and Mrs. Seal desisted from their labours, and the old joke about luncheon, which came out regularly at this hour, was repeated with scarcely any variation of words. Mr. Clacton patronized a vegetarian restaurant. Mrs. Seal brought sandwiches, which she ate with the plane trees in Russell Square, while Mary generally went to a gaudy establishment, upholstered in red plush, nearby, where, much to the vegetarian's disapproval, you could buy steak 2 inches thick, or a roast section of fowl swimming in a pewter dish. The bare branches against the sky do one so much good, Mrs. Seal asserted, looking out into the square. But one can't eat lunch off trees, Sally, said Mary. I confess I don't know how you manage it, Miss Datchet, Mr. Clacton remarked. I should sleep all afternoon, I know, if I took a heavy meal in the middle of the day. What's the very latest thing in literature? Mary asked, good-humouredly pointing to the yellow-covered volume beneath Mr. Clacton's arm, for he invariably read some new French author at lunchtime, or squeezed in a visit to a picture gallery, balancing his social work with an ardent culture, of which he was secretly proud, as Mary had very soon divined. So they parted, and Mary walked away, wondering if they guessed that she really wanted to get away from them, and supposing that they had not quite reached that degree of subtlety. She bought herself an evening paper, which she read as she ate, looking over the top of it again and again at the queer people who were buying cakes or imparting their secrets, until some young woman whom she knew came in, and she called out, "Eleanor, come and sit by me," and they finished their lunch together, parting on the strip of pavement among the different lines of traffic, with a pleasant feeling that they were stepping once more into their separate places in the great and eternally moving pattern of human life. But instead of going straight back to the office today, Mary turned into the British Museum and strolled down the gallery with the shapes of stone until she found an empty seat directly beneath the gaze of the Elgin marbles. She looked at them and seemed, as usual, borne up on some wave of exultation and emotion, by which her life at once became solemn and beautiful, an impression which was due as much perhaps to the solitude and chill and silence of the gallery as to the actual beauty of the statues. One must suppose at least that her emotions were not purely aesthetic, because after she had gazed at the Ulysses for a minute or two, she began to think about Ralph Denham. So secure did she feel with these silent shapes, that she was almost yielded to an impulse to say, "I am in love with you," aloud. The presence of this immense and enduring beauty made her almost alarmingly conscious of her desire, and at the same time proud of a feeling which did not display anything like the same proportions when she was going about her daily work. She repressed her impulse to speak aloud, and rose and wandered about rather aimlessly among the statues, until she found herself in another gallery, devoted to engraved obelisks and winged Assyrian bulls, and her emotion took another turn. She began to picture herself travelling with Ralph in a land where these monsters were couchant in the sand. For, she thought to herself as she gazed fixedly at some information printed behind a piece of glass, the wonderful thing about you is that you're ready for anything. You're not in the least conventional, like most clever men. And she conjured up a scene of herself on a camel's back in the desert, while Ralph commanded a whole tribe of natives. That is what you can do, she went on, moving on to the next statue. You can always make people do what you want. A glow spread over her spirit and filled her eyes with brightness. Nevertheless, before she left the museum, she was very far from saying, even in the privacy of her own mind, "I am in love with you." And that sentence might very well never have framed itself. She was, indeed, rather annoyed with herself for having allowed such an ill-considered breach of her reserve, weakening her powers of resistance, she felt, should this impulse return again. For as she walked along the street to her office, the force of all her customary objections to being in love with anyone overcame her. She did not want to marry at all. It seemed to her that there was something amateurish in bringing love into touch with a perfectly straightforward friendship, such as hers with Ralph, which, for 2 years now, had based itself upon common interests in impersonal topics, such as the housing of the poor or the taxation of land values. But the afternoon spirit differed intrinsically from the morning spirit. Mary found herself watching the flight of a bird, or making drawings of the branches of the plane trees upon her blotting paper. People came in to see Mr. Clacton on business, and a seductive smell of cigarette smoke issued from his room. Mrs. Seal wandered about with newspaper cuttings, which seemed to her either quite splendid or really too bad for words. She used to paste these into books or send them to her friends, having first drawn a broad bar in blue pencil down the margin, a proceeding which signified equally and indistinguishably the depths of her reprobation or the heights of her approval. About 4 o'clock on that same afternoon, Katharine Hilbery was walking up Kingsway. The question of tea presented itself. The street lamps were being lit already, and as she stood still for a moment beneath one of them, she tried to think of some neighbouring drawing room where there would be firelight and talk congenial to her mood. The mood, owing to the spinning traffic and the evening veil of unreality, was ill-adapted to her home surroundings. Perhaps, on the whole, a shop was the best place in which to preserve this queer sense of heightened existence. At the same time, she wished to talk. Remembering Mary Datchet and her repeated invitations, she crossed the road, turned into Russell Square, and peered about, seeking for numbers with a sense of adventure that was out of all proportion to the deed itself. She found herself in a dimly lighted hall, unguarded by a porter, and pushed open the first swing door. But the office boy had never heard of Miss Datchet. Did she belong to the SRFR? Katharine shook her head with a smile of dismay. A voice from within shouted, "No, the SGS, top floor." Katharine mounted past innumerable glass doors, with initials on them, and became steadily more and more doubtful of the wisdom of her venture. At the top she paused for a moment to breathe and collect herself. She heard the typewriter and formal professional voices inside, not belonging, she thought, to anyone she had ever spoken to. She touched the bell, and the door was opened almost immediately by Mary herself. Her face had to change its expression entirely when she saw Katharine. "You," she exclaimed. "We thought you were the printer." Still holding the door open, she called back, "No, Mr. Clacton, it's not Pennington's. I should ring them up again. 3388 Central." "Well, this is a surprise. Come in," she added. "You're just in time for tea." The lights of relief shone in Mary's eyes. The boredom of the afternoon was dissipated at once, and she was glad that Katharine had found them in a momentary press of activity, owing to the failure of the printer to send back certain proofs. The unshaded electric light shining upon the table covered with papers dazed Katharine for a moment. After the confusion of her twilight walk and her random thoughts, life in this small room appeared extremely concentrated and bright. She turned instinctively to look out of the window, which was uncurtained, but Mary immediately recalled her. "It was very clever of you to find your way," she said, and Mary wondered as she stood there, feeling for the moment entirely detached and unabsorbed, why she had come. She looked indeed to Mary's eyes strangely out of place in the office. Her figure in the long cloak, which took deep folds, and her face, which was composed into a mask of sensitive apprehension, disturbed Mary for a moment with a sense of the presence of someone who was of another world, and therefore subversive of her world. She became immediately anxious that Katharine should be impressed by the importance of her work, and hoped that neither Mrs. Seal nor Mr. Clacton would appear until the impression of importance had been received. But in this she was disappointed. Mrs. Seal burst into the room holding a kettle in her hand, which she set upon the stove, and then, with inefficient haste, she set light to the gas, which flared up, exploded, and went out. Always the way, she muttered. Kit Markham is the only person who knows how to deal with the thing. Mary had to go to her help, and together they spread the table and apologized for the disparity between the cups and the plainness of the food. "If we had known Miss Hilbery was coming, we should have bought a cake," said Mary, upon which Mrs. Seal looked at Katharine for the first time, suspiciously, because she was a person who needed cake. Here Mr. Clacton opened the door and came in, holding a typewritten letter in his hand, which he was reading aloud. "Selford's affiliated," he said. "Well done, Selford," Mrs. Seal exclaimed enthusiastically, thumping the teapot which she had set upon the table in token of applause. "Yes, these provincial centres seem to be coming into line at last," said Mr. Clacton. And then Mary introduced him to Miss Hilbery, and he asked her, in a very formal manner, if she were interested in our work. "And the proof's still not come," said Mrs. Seal, putting both her elbows on the table and propping her chin on her hands as Mary began to pour out the tea. "It's too bad, too bad. At this rate we shall miss the country post. Which reminds me, Mr. Clacton, don't you think we should circularize the provinces with Partridge's last speech? What, you've not read it? Oh, it's the best thing they've had in the House this session, even the Prime Minister." But Mary cut her short. "We don't allow shop at tea, Sally," she said firmly. "We fine her a penny each time she forgets, and the fine's going to buying a plum cake," she explained, seeking to draw Katharine into the community. She had given up all hope of impressing her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Seal apologized. "It's my misfortune to be an enthusiast," she said, turning to Katharine. "My father's daughter could hardly be anything else. I think I've been on as many committees as most people. Waifs and strays, rescue work, church work, COS, local branch, besides the usual civic duties which fall to one as a householder. But I've given them all up for our work here, and I don't regret it for a second," she added. "This is the root question, I feel, until women have votes." "It'll be 6 pence at least, Sally," said Mary, bringing her fist down on the table. "And we're all sick to death of women and their votes." Mrs. Seal looked for a moment as though she could hardly believe her ears, and made a deprecating in her throat, looking alternately at Katharine and Mary, and shaking her head as she did so. Then she remarked, rather confidently to Katharine, with a little nod in Mary's direction, "She's doing more for the cause than any of us. She's giving her youth, for alas, when I was young, there was domestic circumstances." She sighed and stopped short. Mr. Clacton hastily reverted to the joke about luncheon, and explained how Mrs. Seal fed on a bag of biscuits under the trees, whatever the weather might be. Rather, Katharine thought, as though Mrs. Seal were a pet dog who had convenient tricks. "Yes, I took my little bag to the square," said Mrs. Seal, with the self-conscious guilt of a child owning some fault to its elders. It was really very sustaining, and the bare boughs against the sky do one so much good. "But I shall have to give up going into the square," she proceeded, wrinkling her forehead, then justice of it. "Why should I have a beautiful square all to myself, when poor women who need rest have nowhere at all to sit. She looked fiercely at Katharine, giving her short locks a little shake. It's dreadful what a tyrant one still is in spite of all one's efforts. One tries to lead a decent life, but one can't. Of course, directly one thinks of it, one sees that all squares should be open to everyone. Is there any society with that object, Mr. Clacton? If not, there should be, surely. A most excellent object, said Mr. Clacton in his professional manner. At the same time, one must deplore the ramification of organizations, Mrs. Seal. So much excellent effort thrown away, not to speak of pounds, shillings, and pence. Now, how many organizations of a philanthropic nature do you suppose there are in the city of London itself, Miss Hilbery? He added, screwing his mouth into a queer little smile, as if to show that the question had its frivolous side. Katharine smiled too. Her unlikeness to the rest of them had by this time penetrated to Mr. Clacton, who was not naturally observant, and he was wondering who she was. This same unlikeness had subtly stimulated Mrs. Seal to try and make a convert of her. Mary, too, looked at her almost as if she begged her to make things easy. For Katharine had shown no disposition to make things easy. She had scarcely spoken, and her silence, though grave and even thoughtful, seemed to Mary the silence of one who criticizes. Well, there are more in this house than I had any notion of it, she said. On the ground floor you protect natives. On the next you immigrate women and tell people to eat nuts. Why do you say that we do these things? Mary interposed rather sharply. We're not responsible for all the cranks who choose to lodge in the same house with us. Mr. Clacton cleared his throat and looked at each of the young ladies in turn. He was a good deal struck by the appearance and manner of Miss Hilbery, which seemed to him to place her among those cultivated and luxurious people of whom he used to dream. Mary, on the other hand, was more of his own sort, and a little too much inclined to order him about. He picked up crumbs of dry biscuit and put them into his mouth with incredible rapidity. You don't belong to our society, then? Said Mrs. Seal. No, I'm afraid I don't, said Katharine, with such ready candour that Mrs. Seal was nonplussed, and stared at her with a puzzled expression, as if she could not classify her among the varieties of human beings known to her. But surely, she began. Mrs. Seal is an enthusiast in these matters, said Mr. Clacton, almost apologetically. But we have to remind her sometimes that others have a right to their views, even if they differ from our own. Punch has a very funny picture this week about a suffragist in an agricultural labour. Have you seen this week's Punch, Miss Datchet? Mary laughed and said no. Mr. Clacton then told them the substance of the joke, which, however, depended a good deal for its success upon the expression which the artist had put into the people's faces. Mrs. Seal sat all the time perfectly grave. Directly he had done speaking, she burst out, But surely, if you care about the welfare of your sex at all, you must wish them to have the vote. I never said I didn't wish them to have the vote, Katharine protested. Then why aren't you a member of our society? Mrs. Seal demanded. Katharine stirred her spoon round and round, staring into the swirl of the tea, and remained silent. Mr. Clacton meanwhile framed a question, which, after a moment's hesitation, he put to Katharine. Are you any way related, I wonder, to the poet Allardyce? His daughter, I believe, married a Mr. Hilbery. Yes, I'm the poet's granddaughter, said Katharine, with a little sigh, after a pause, and for a moment they were all silent. The poet's granddaughter, Mrs. Seal repeated, half to herself, with a shake of her head, as if that explained what was otherwise inexplicable. The light kindled in Mr. Clacton's eye. Ah, indeed, that interests me very much, he said. I owe a great debt to your grandfather, Miss Hilbery. At one time I could have repeated the greater part of him by heart, but one gets out of the way of reading poetry, unfortunately. You don't remember him, I suppose. A sharp rap at the door made Catherine's answer inaudible. Mrs. Seal looked up with renewed hope in her eyes, and exclaiming, "The proof's at last," ran to open the door. "Oh, it's only Mr. Denham," she cried, without any attempt to conceal her disappointment. Ralph, Catherine supposed, was a frequent visitor, for the only person he thought it necessary to greet was herself, and Mary at once explained the strange fact of her being here by saying, "Catherine has come to see how one runs an office." Ralph felt himself stiffen uncomfortably as he said, "I hope Mary hasn't persuaded you that she knows how to run an office." "What? Doesn't she?" said Catherine, looking from one to the other. At these remarks, Mrs. Seal began to exhibit signs of discomposure, which displayed themselves by a tossing movement of her head, and as Ralph took a letter from his pocket and placed his finger upon a certain sentence, she forestalled him by exclaiming in confusion, "Now I know what you're going to say, Mr. Denham, but it was the day Kit Markham was here, and she upsets one so, with her wonderful vitality, always thinking of something new that we ought to be doing and aren't. And I was conscious at the time that my dates were mixed. It had nothing to do with Mary at all, I assure you." "My dear Sally, don't apologize," said Mary, laughing. "Men are such pedants. They don't know what things matter and what things don't." "Now, Mr. Denham, speak up for our sex," said Mr. Clacton in a jocular manner. Indeed. But, like most insignificant men, he was very quick to resent being found fault with by a woman, an argument with whom he was fond of calling himself a mere man. He wished, however, to enter into a literary conversation with Miss Hilbery, and thus let the matter drop. "Doesn't it seem strange to you, Miss Hilbery," he said, "that the French, with all their wealth of illustrious names, have no poet who can compare with your grandfather? Let me see, there's Chenier and Hugo and Alfred de Musset, wonderful men, but at the same time, there's a richness, a freshness about Allardyce." Here the telephone bell rang, and he had to absent himself with a smile and a bow, which signified that, although literature is delightful, it is not work. Mrs. Seal rose at the same time, but remained hovering over the table, delivering herself of a tirade against party government. "For if I were to tell you that I know of backstairs intrigue, and what can be done by the power of the purse, you wouldn't credit me, Mr. Denham, you wouldn't, indeed. This is why I feel that it is the only work for my father's daughter, for he was one of the pioneers, Mr. Denham, and on his tombstone I had that verse from the Psalms put about the sowers and the seed. And what wouldn't I give that he should be alive now, seeing what we're going to see?" But reflecting that the glories of the future depended in part upon the activity of her typewriter, she bobbed her head and hurried back into the seclusion of her little room, from which immediately issued sounds of enthusiastic, but obviously erratic, composition. Mary made it clear at once, by starting a fresh topic of general interest, that though she saw the humour of her colleague, she did not intend to have her laughed at. "The standard of morality seems to me frightfully low," she observed reflectively, pouring out a second cup of tea, "especially among women who aren't well educated. They don't see that the small things matter, and that's where the leakage begins, and then we find ourselves in difficulties. I very nearly lost my temper yesterday," she went on, looking at Ralph with a little smile, as though he knew what happened when she lost her temper. "It makes me very angry when people tell me lies. Doesn't it make you angry?" she asked Catherine. "But considering that everyone tells lies," Catherine remarked, looking about the room to see where she had put down her umbrella and her parcel. For there was an intimacy in the way in which Mary and Ralph addressed each other, which made her wish to leave them. Mary, on the other hand, was anxious, superficially at least, that Catherine should stay, and so fortify her in her determination not to be in love with Ralph. Ralph, while lifting his cup from his lips to the table, had made up his mind that if Miss Hilbery left, he would go with her. I don't think that I tell lies, and I don't think that Ralph tells lies. Do you, Ralph? Mary continued. Katharine laughed, with more gaiety, as it seemed to Mary, than she could properly account for. What was she laughing at? At them, presumably. Katharine had risen, and was glancing hither and thither at the presses and the cupboards, and all the machinery of the office, as if she included them in all her rather malicious amusement, which caused Mary to keep her eyes on her straightly and rather fiercely, as if she were a gay-plumed, mischievous bird who might light on the topmost bough and pick off the ruddiest cherry without any warning. Two women less like each other could scarcely be imagined, Ralph thought, looking from one to the other. Next moment he too rose, and nodding to Mary as Katharine said goodbye, opened the door for her and followed her out. Mary sat still and made no attempt to prevent them from going. For a second or two after the door had shut on them, her eyes rested on the door with a straightforward fierceness in which, for a moment, a certain degree of bewilderment seemed to enter. But after a brief hesitation, she put down her cup and proceeded to clear away the tea things. The impulse which had driven Ralph to take this action was the result of a very swift little piece of reasoning, and thus, perhaps, was not quite so much of an impulse as it seemed. It passed through his mind that if he missed this chance of talking to Katharine, he would have to face an enraged ghost when he was alone in his room again, demanding an explanation of his cowardly indecision. It was better on the whole to risk present discomfiture than to waste an evening bandying excuses and constructing impossible scenes with this uncompromising section of himself. For ever since he had visited the Hilberys, had been much at the mercy of a phantom Katharine, who came to him when he sat alone, and answered him as he would have her answer, and was always beside him to crown those varying triumphs which were transacted almost every night in imaginary scenes, as he walked through the lamplit streets home from the office. To walk with Katharine in the flesh would either feed that phantom with fresh food, which, as all who nourish dreams are aware, is a process that becomes necessary from time to time, or refine it to such a degree of thinness that it was scarcely serviceable any longer, and that, too, is sometimes a welcome change to a dreamer. And all the time Ralph was well aware that the bulk of Katharine was not represented in his dreams at all, so that when he met her he was bewildered by the fact that she had nothing to do with his dream of her. When, on reaching the street, Katharine found that Mr. Denham proceeded to keep pace by her side, she was surprised and, perhaps, a little annoyed. She too had her margin of imagination, and tonight her activity in this obscure region of the mind required solitude. If she had had her way, she would have walked very fast down the Tottenham Court Road, and then sprung into a cab and raced swiftly home. The view she had had of the inside of an office was of the nature of a dream to her. Shut off up there, she compared Mrs. Seal and Mary Datchet, and Mr. Clacton, to enchanted people in a bewitched tower, with the spider's webs looping across the corners of the room, and all the tools of the necromancer's craft at hand. For so aloof and unreal and apart from the normal world did they seem to her, in the house of innumerable typewriters, murmuring their incantations and concocting their drugs, and flinging their frail spider's webs over the torrent of life which rushed down the streets outside. She may have been conscious that there was some exaggeration in this fancy of hers, for she certainly did not wish to share it with Ralph. To him, she supposed, Mary Datchet, composing leaflets for cabinet ministers among her typewriters, represented all that was interesting and genuine, and accordingly she shut them both out from all share in the crowded street, with its pendant necklace of lamps, its lighted windows, and its throng of men and women, which exhilarated her to such an extent that she very nearly forgot her companion. She walked very fast, and the effect of people passing in the opposite direction was to produce a queer dizziness both in her head and in Ralph's, which set their bodies far apart. But she did her duty by her companion almost unconsciously. Mary Datchet does that sort of work very well. She's responsible for it, I suppose. Yes, the others don't help at all. Has she made a convert of you? Oh no. That is, I'm a convert already. But she hasn't persuaded you to work for them. Oh dear no. That wouldn't do at all. So they walked down on the Tottenham Court Road, parting and coming together again. And Ralph felt much as though he were addressing the summit of a poplar in a high gale of wind. Suppose we get onto that omnibus, he suggested. Katharine acquiesced, and they climbed up and found themselves alone on top of it. But which way are you going? Katharine asked, waking a little from the trance into which the movement among moving things had thrown her. I'm going to the temple, Ralph replied, inventing a destination on the spur of the moment. He felt the change come over her as they sat down and the omnibus began to move forward. He imagined her contemplating the avenue in front of them with those honest, sad eyes, which seemed to set him at such distance from them. But the breeze was blowing in their faces. It lifted her hat for a second, and she drew out a pin and stuck it in again. A little action which seemed, for some reason, to make her rather more fallible. Ah, if only her hat would blow off and leave her altogether disheveled, accepting it from his hands. And I think I'll leave it there. As always, if you'd like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.